Welcome to Conversations from the Continent with the Movement for Economic and Social Development in Africa, MESTA. This is a platform where we engage with Africa's most inspiring thought leaders, professionals, and doers that are driving transformation on the continent. On this podcast, we tell African stories, discuss solutions for African challenges, and shape positive African narratives to mentor and inspire our listeners. On this season, we will cover a wide range of topics across different fields, including entrepreneurship, healthcare, activism, nonprofit work, entertainment, climate change, and politics. My name is Meamande Wamkwamba, and I am your host. Our guest on today's episode is Ms Furaha-Joy Sekai Saungweme, a women's rights advocate and the founder of the Africa End Sexual Harassment Initiative. She's also an advisory board member of the Berkeley Centre on Comparative Equality and Anti-Discrimination Law, and the author of several publications on gender, democracy, and human rights in Africa. Ma'am Furaha, welcome to Conversations from the Continent.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm so grateful for the invitation.
It's a pleasure to have you. So we have an icebreaker on our first question on the show is always understanding what our guest's name is. So I hope I pronounced your names correctly, but do you know what Furaha means, Sekai, and Sao?
Okay. Yeah, so Furaha is Swahili. It means happiness. I was born in Tanzania, so I have Tanzanian roots.
Interesting.
But my mother is Zimbabwean, and I was raised by my mom, and primarily in Zimbabwe. So, but I have the Swahili, the Tanzanian side of my family call me Furaha. And my mother, called me Joy,
Right.
And it was easier for those who struggled with pronouncing Furaha to just say Joy.
Joy.
And but Sakai is my Shona name, and it means laughter. So that's what it is. Furaha-Joy Sekai Saungweme. Yeah, Saungweme is my surname.
Very nice names. I think that's why you have a very light and cheerful spirit. You know, there's power in the name. Sometimes
Absolutely.
when you learn somebody's name, then like you kind of understand a few things about their personality, and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, makes sense. You have
Yes.
have amazing names. So we're gonna jump right into the next question, and we just want to understand more about who you are, your journey so far, and what led you to start the Africa End Sexual Harassment Initiative. If you were to summarize your journey so far, how would you share that with us?
Oh, wow. Thank you for the question. It was a lot of different components that involved my own experiences as well as the experiences of colleagues and friends around me, and also just what was happening regionally and globally.
Right.
So I would say that around 2018, I believe that the Me Too movement did have a impact on me. I also began to sort of connect the dots with things that were happening, globally, and that had happened in my own experiences, and being like, oh wow, that was actually sexual harassment.
Right.
I didn't know it had a name. But I was also fascinated around that time. The African Union was dealing with um, sexual harassment. They'd set up a commission of inquiry. The SABC, in South Africa's biggest broadcasting media house, was, had also set up a commission of inquiry to investigate allegations of sexual harassment. Makerere University had set up, a similar process. So And then there were sort of rumblings within the Pan-African Parliament as well. So this was really something that began to intrigue me. As a lawyer, I began to look at the laws. I really wanted to understand, what is this? What does the law say about sexual harassment? So I began, an amateur sort of research investigation into sexual harassment laws in the continent. Not every continent, but just a few countries, including Zimbabwe, and then just comparing them to what was, the, you know, scenarios in other countries, within the US and Australia and India. And, I came up with very interesting information.
Right.
And so, yeah, I decided, that, we actually need a whole movement around this. And that's what led to Africa End Sexual Harassment Initiative, the regional network.
Amazing. And I know you do a focus a lot in terms of advocating against sexual harassment, particularly amongst human rights defenders. But before we kind of unpack that, for the benefit of our listeners, what is your definition of sexual harassment? Because, I think like you've mentioned, a lot of us, myself included, only look at certain situations or interactions in hindsight, and you're like, that was actually harassment. Those people were harassing.
Hmm.
So I think
Hmm.
before we even go deeper into the conversation, what is your definition of sexual harassment?
Yeah, for sure. I think, one of the interesting findings on my initial, amateurish research in 2018 and early 2019 was that there was a very fragmented approach with respect to how laws approach sexual harassment and the definition.
Right.
And but basically, sexual harassment is a form of unfair discrimination, and it's which is prohibited on the grounds of sex and gender. And it really now depends on which constitution you're looking at, but South Africa is a good example of that. There are, other countries that define sexual harassment as a form of labor, um,
Right.
as a form of unfair labor practice. Um, and then there are others that, define it as criminal conduct. But, across the board, there is that element of something that is of a sexual nature, something that is generally regarded as unwelcome. And usually there are power dynamics at play. So, there are laws that be more specific about, a vertical of it being an offense within vertical relationships, employer, employee, someone who has authority over you, you know.
Right.
Yeah. So those are the basic elements. And then of course you look at it from additional two angles of quid pro quo scenario, as well as a hostile working environment. Quid
Mm,
pro quo is, more direct when, they sex for a job, right?
right.
Sex for work, and then sex for opportunity, sex for promotion, those types of things. And then there's the hostile work environment as well. And that is when they actually make it so difficult for you to continue to work there. The
Mm,
environment becomes very difficult. This is particularly the case where maybe you report an action around sexual harassment. I would say in my case, um, I, I I remember being in a working environment once, and all around me, the women were in a sexual relationship with the one particular man, you know,
mm,
but I was not fully aware of this. So um, I was being denied like a fair contract, a fair promotion, just fair contractual arrangement because I was not in the same type of relationship as these other women were. So
mm.
if you had a sexual relationship with him, then it led to that,
The way.
a proper recognition in the workplace.
Right.
But because I was not part of that, but I was never ever directly approached, but I was definitely impacted. So that was definitely an example of a hostile work environment,
Mm,
where you know that you're not getting a fair recognition of your skills, um, a fair reflection of what your capabilities are professionally,
right.
because you're not in a sexual relationship with the decision maker.
And it's interesting you talk about vertical relationships because particularly in civil society and when you're dealing, for example, with human rights defenders, which you specialize in quite a bit, by the very nature of human rights defending, the relationship is often a vertical one in the sense that the given HRD in a space probably has access to knowledge, access to resources, or access to certain things that give them some level of superiority to the people that they are serving. And what you then find in practice is that, it's essentially access to that. So there's a lot of dependency on the goodwill of a particular HRD. So you find that in most cases, you then start receiving reports of HRDs leveraging the resources they have in exchange for sexual favors. But then quickly, I wanted to ask something and I wanted to get your opinion on something because I was listening to an interesting podcast that was also discussing this. And they were also talking about the line between workplace relationships and sexual harassment. Uh, where do you think the line is drawn? Because some offices do not explicitly prohibit romantic relationships amongst coworkers, but then
Mhm.
at which point does it become sexual harassment? I don't know if you get my question. Where do you kind of draw the line? I think it's
Mhm.
important for people to understand this thing.
Mm. The workplace it's a very interesting place. This is where, if you are in the formal, employment, informal employment, this is where you're probably going to spend the majority of your life. This is where you're going to build your most meaningful relationships, right?
Right.
And the truth is that people will meet and form bonds and relationships, including romantic relationships, in the workplace. This is true. Um, so we at AESHI are not against that. We are not against consent, right?
Mm,
And that's the other thing when it comes down to the definition. We are not against consensual relationships, but even the issue of consent has to be really looked at in a very contextual way, right?
right.
Because sometimes consent is not always consent.
Right.
Um, so I would say that Convention C-190, provides a good grasp of what constitutes the workplace. I think that it's important for a workplace to establish rules, and those rules should not be arbitrary. What should happen is that there should be clear regulations within the workplace based on laws that properly articulate what sexual harassment is,
Right.
at a national level, right? Um, what should be prevented is the abuse of power, right? And that abuse of power can be because of the vertical, relationship, and it can be, because of the gender, right?
Right.
Your coworker can sexually harass you. Your coworker may not necessarily have sort of authority over you, but maybe because of the, gender inequality and the perception of women being, in a workplace being a step beneath a male counterpart, that can, just cause some men to feel that they have the right to be unpleasant, right?
Right.
Um, they Everybody should practice with, their should practice wisdom and sensitivity around this. So I think that there should be a clear definition of what the workplace is. I recall a case in Kenya where there was it went to court, and this is two colleagues went to South Africa. It was a trip outside of Kenya.
Right.
And what happened is that on that trip, this woman was sexually harassed by this man, you know, in the sense that when they get to South Africa, he has booked one room. He has ensured that they have one room to share, right? And and she's like, wait, but where's my room? And so she was literally almost forced to share that same room with, and when she refused to enter into a sexual engagement with him, he kicked her out, and they go back to Kenya, and she has to report this. So this didn't happen within the physical boundaries of the workplace. It happened, but it was part of the working relationship. So the same thing also applies with like maybe cocktail parties, networking events that an organization may host, because that is also something that may be considered to be a gray area.
Right.
It didn't happen in the workplace, so to what extent is the reach of the employer if you're dealing with that? But these are all sort of work related, and they will have an impact on on the employee, the confidence and the ability of the employee to do their work after
Right.
having such an unpleasant encounter, you
Right.
know. So I think that the definition of the workplace has to be understood broadly. Consent has to be understood contextually, you
Mm.
know. Um, the fact that um, the fact that you may find these like within university settings, right, where you have um, very influential professors
Right.
um, who are useful to the university because they write a lot of books. They bring that sort of good influence for that university. So the university sort of needs them. This is like a star person for the university. But this professor is someone who sexually harasses their students, you know.
Right.
Um, and if a student consents in that respect, is that really consent? You're a student, maybe you're the first person to break this cycle of poverty, the first person to get into university, your family is relying on you,
Yeah.
and you're put into a situation where it's um it's either you to get that grade, and I'm glad that you raised this because you know this was also investigated by BBC Africa with their documentary Six for Grade, and this is also around 2018. Nigeria and Ghana universities
Yeah. I
really
remember
dealt
that.
with this issue. Yes,
Mm.
exactly. So it's those issues you deal with really just bring you to the question of what exactly is consent. you know
Yes.
what is consent. It was interesting that Nigeria is an example of a country that then developed this bill, but the bill is yet to be signed by the president. Very strangely, that it has still not been signed into law. But Parliament passed the bill, but it's yet to be signed, so it's not yet law. But this bill addresses the issue of consent within tertiary institutions and sexual harassment, and they basically just did away with consent. You know,
Right.
they banned consensual relationships. They don't agree with it. They just said there's no such thing as consent when it comes to this,
Mm.
because it's so difficult to discern, was the student really willing? Was the student not
Yes.
willing? You know. But the other thing that I think workplace and organizations can do when it comes to some of these relationships is just to have transparency and accountability.
Right.
I don't think that there should be like a high level of policing of adult relationships in the workplace.
Mm.
Um, but you know,
Yeah,
It's very tricky, but I think that ultimately, um, there should always be um, there should always be a discretion, and there should always be a sensitivity, and each person, each adult person, should exercise their own, just their own wisdom in
right.
terms of, okay, so if I approach this woman, I'm the boss, I'm the head of this department, I'm the boss, and you know what does
What are
this
the
mean?
implications? Right,
What are
right,
the implications of that? But what we want to do is to avoid the exploitation, the abuse, because
right.
that is a reality as well. And that puts, unfortunately, women who are disproportionately impacted, that puts a lot of women at a disadvantage because
Mhm.
of this type of behavior.
Right. It's so interesting. You've mentioned so many important things that I wanted to kind of comment on. The first thing that I think is amazing about the work that you're doing is clarifying what consent is and contextualizing it. And I think, be, when you just see a yes as a yes without actually unpacking where that yes is coming from, where like you're mentioning, people have to provide for their families, they're afraid to lose their jobs, they're afraid to be blacklisted. Then you find people are under a lot of undue influence or duress, and their consent is influenced by that. And that's something that we don't really speak about too much. And we just say, she agreed, or he agreed, without actually really looking at the context of why a person came to a certain decision. And you also talked about when this case that you dealt with somebody who was on a trip with their boss. And something I've observed about civil society that makes it really susceptible to sexual harassment, I think, is its informal nature.
Mm-hmm.
Civil society generally is a lot of field work. So you're traveling with colleagues, you're staying in hotels with colleagues. It's not necessarily as strict as the corporate world where, I show up at the office at 8 a.m., I leave at 5 p.m. We don't really
Mm-hmm.
interact with each other in a casual setting. I think civil society is slightly different because you spend a lot of time with colleagues in environments that are not necessarily strictly formal. And I agree with you that because of that, it's really important to have very defined rules of engagement to kind
Mm-hmm.
of inform how we interact. And the lack of that is what is then leaving this big gray area that is then being abused or exploited. But quickly, I wanted to ask you something. You just when you started and you were giving your definition of sexual harassment, you said something interesting about sexual harassment also being defined as a labor practice. And
Mm-hmm.
this
As an unfair labor practice.
as an
Yeah. I
unfair
think that's
labor
the
practice.
Zimbabwe definition. Mm-hmm.
Right. And I wanted to kind of link that to how African culture ties to this problem of sexual harassment across industries, right? And back again to the example you gave of the lady who shows up and there's just one room. In many,
Mm-hmm.
many unhealthy African cultures, women are objectified and seen as property. And there is a
Mm-hmm.
certain sense of entitlement to the female body. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and women generally struggle with having autonomy over themselves. There's just this general that, you can be walking in the road and a person just feels entitled to touch you, greet you. It's just a way of life as women. Uh, how do you think African culture is also, maybe not just African culture generally, but negative African cultures? How do you think they are fueling this crisis that we are observing uh, across the continent in terms of sexual harassment and the inability to effectively address it?
Yeah, I would say that the issue of the African culture and how it influences the objectification of women and the direct or indirect impact on how this begins to show up in the workplace. It can also be, you can also see a pattern of that in judgments that deal with issues of these sexual relationships, consent, and I'm looking at the case of S versus Coco. It's a South African judgment that dealt with a student. I think she was a Rhodes student, or well, she was a student in South Africa in a relationship
Right.
with a gentleman, and you know, basically, but there was an agreement, and I don't think he denied it that she was not going to have sex before marriage. And I think that they actually came from a church environment, so
Mhm.
probably she had that understanding that they were on the same page. But one night, she spent the night with him. I think that there had been agreement that nothing was going to go beyond a certain point. But according to both of them, there was foreplay, and then, penetration, right?
Right.
Which she had not consented to. And she was very clear, in all the communications that she had said no. But this judgment was so interesting in terms of just how the judge in this case articulated this, because according to this judge, foreplay amounted to consent, you know.
Mm.
I mean, the fact that you consented to that meant that you consented to one stage, meant that you consented to the next stage, right? And
Right.
in conversations with some men, um, in trainings around some of these issues about what consent is, eh, there's an interesting question that has been raised by, some of our trainers that will ask, eh, can a man control himself, at a certain stage? And
Mm.
some of these men will say, no, they may not be talking about themselves personally, but they have a perception of
Right.
you're unable to control yourself, or something like that.
Mm.
And that is a narrative that that I think that is sort of embedded not just within the African culture, but just across this um this locker room man manly apparently type of culture that men are just driven this way. This is what they want, and they are not able to control themselves. And if you dress a certain way, then you're going to provoke this sort of reaction, And I mean, the problem with that sort of theory is that it then doesn't respond to other types of theories. Like, okay, so did a 7-year-old child provoke that?
Mm.
That sexual encounter? Did a woman who was dressed in a sack provoke that type of response, that type of sexual unwelcome sexual conduct, so it
Mm.
doesn't explain everything. So yeah, it is very interesting. I think that it's important for there to be respect, and that is also the importance. That's why it's also important to have these ground rules in the workplace, where the tone is set that men and women are equal, there is respect, and everybody has a right to their bodily autonomy, you know.
Right.
And when you are approaching someone from the basis of respect, it really sort of changes the ball game just in terms of what follows then, whether it's going to be a consensual relationship on both sides, or whether it's going to be something that is a clear abuse of power. And I must say that even though we strongly believe that the issue of consent is very murky in many instances, many of the cases that we've dealt with, you know, that have gone to court and that have not gone to court, just as we talk with survivors, many of those cases really show a pattern of a clear um, lack of interest in the perpetrator,
Right.
there was no consent, but
Mm,
the perpetrator persisted, you know,
yeah.
sending, unwelcome messages of a sexual nature, images,
Right.
and really abusing their power,
Mm,
and dangling the issue of a contract, whether or not your contract will get renewed or not, really,
yeah.
We had one case in Tanzania, where, after getting this contract, which is a short-term contract, and just being sexually harassed by the man in a position of power, when that contract ended, it was not renewed, you
Mm.
know.
I wanted
So,
to ask something quickly.
mm,
If when before as you talk about perceptions, um, you know, reports indicate that while there's a majority of women that are dealing with sexual harassment, men are also dealing with sexual harassment. And some research I did leading to this conversation, I found a trend where particularly younger men in the workplace have reported having challenges with older females in the workplace, who are in
mhm.
positions of power, who are doing the exact same things you're saying, threatening you to, to lose your job, things like that. Do you address at AESHI, are you collectively addressing sexual harassment for men and women? And are there any commonalities there? Or how are you approaching that? Maybe as you go on briefly.
Yeah, I would say for sure it is true that um men can be subjected to sexual harassment. I mean, there's also, like, even, same-sex sexual harassment, right? Um, we've had, some men say, like, their male employers, requested sex of them. I mean, these things do
Right,
happen.
right,
Um, but and there are some laws that are very biased on that. I think India has sexual harassment legislation addressing sexual harassment, and recognizing women only as victims of sexual harassment. Look, ultimately, men can be victims of sexual harassment just as women can be, but disproportionately, it is women
right,
who are impacted by
right,
this. That's
right,
just the reality. So it should never be treated as as an
right.
equal opportunity, or
I hear you.
equal, yeah, because
Right.
women are always just disproportionately impacted, and that's really the reality.
Yes.
Um yeah.
Awesome. And we're kind of bringing our conversation to a close already. Time flies. But maybe in under a minute or two, what advice would you give to young Africans, particularly young women who have interest in advocating and against sexual harassment and pursuing a similar path as you have?
Well, I would say that um you have to be, prepared to be bold. It's not for the faint-hearted. You have to be bold, especially when you're dealing with power dynamics. And I would really say push for law reform. We were definitely, very disappointed to hear all these reports of sexual harassment by, within the human rights defenders, community. And when we had a closer look at it, we looked at the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. We looked at that a UN declaration, which is fine to have that, but it is a declaration that really is silent on the obligations and responsibilities of human rights defenders to each other and to the communities they serve. And so I would say to young women, look at what your laws and your international laws are saying, and identify entry points that you can advocate on.
Right.
The fact that you have a declaration on human rights defenders, which, really play, sort of assumes impeccable conduct on the part of human rights defenders, which is for the majority. I'm sure human rights defenders, are honest brokers who are committed to the concept of human rights and defend this in an honorable way. But the potential exploitation is there. So there should be serious repercussions. And the Human Rights Declaration, referring to human rights defenders, should
Mm,
should look at it in that way as well. It should acknowledge, the potential for exploitation, because the human rights defenders, not only are they themselves vulnerable, but they also, because of, undemocratic practices and things like that, but they're also dealing with vulnerable people,
right,
right? So
right,
it's really, really important that we have, we look at these things from both sides. So
right.
I would say, to young women, especially those who are young lawyers who want to go into law students, you know, um, I believe that gaps in laws are important entry points that you can examine and use as a foundational ground for advocacy.
Furaha, thank you so much for taking the time to join us to have this very important and timely discussion. Thank you for the work that you are doing so boldly on the continent, especially, it's not easy to be the first to come against a culture of behaviors that have been normalized. So even as we wind up, I just wanted to commend you for the work that you're doing, and we hope to see you again soon, hopefully when you're on the continent again. And yeah, thank you
Mhm.
for taking the time to join us.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for giving visibility to this very important topic.
Thank you. Thank you.